Okay, so I have a real question. Is Britain broke, or are we just really bad with money? So hear me out. If you've lived in the UK over the past decade, you've probably heard some form or other, at least once a week, from politicians, from the media, the press, that smug guy that you met that studied PP at Oxford, saying something like, there's no money left, or we're maxed out, or the national credit card is broken. And yet somehow, some way, there always seems to be money for, certain things. Am I right? You know how it goes. There's a few billion for defense here, a big tax cut for highest earners, or rather the wealthy, and a vanity infrastructure project that runs over by 700%. Classic. But when it comes to doing things that we really need, like fixing school roofs, funding social care, or giving nurses a decent pay rise, suddenly we're a poor country again. So in today's episode, I'm going to talk about public finances. Before you switch off, it's not going to be like an economics lecture, I promise. There's not going to be no, PowerPoint or spreadsheets or anything like that. I just want to have a chat about money, about national money, about our money, about your money. Because when I look at it, we're told often about the nation's budget, right? And it sounds sensible, but when you dig into it, it's mostly myths and metaphors and really, really, really weird priorities. As of right now, the UK's national debt stands at about £2.7 trillion. Yes, that's trillion with a T. So that's roughly 97% of our GDP. I don't know why I'm laughing. I also have debt myself, but it definitely isn't 90% of my gross income. So if you don't know, GDP stands for gross domestic product, basically everything the country produces in a year. Now, obviously, if you pay attention to debt leverage and whatever, that sounds terrifying, doesn't it? Like, if that were your credit card, you'd be on some kind of Channel 5 special with Martin Lewis or something, staging an intervention for you. 97% is humongous. But let's pause, because that number by itself doesn't actually mean that we're broke. Here's a secret that a lot of politicians don't have the courage to say out loud. Almost every major country is in debt. Big debt. Bigger than ours. Japan, debt to GDP ratio over 250%. The US, around 120%. France, Italy, Canada, all above 100%. And no one is walking around calling them failed states. Because what actually matters isn't how much you owe, it's how manageable the payments are. And this, well, this is where things have kind of got tricky for the UK. Because interest rates have gone up a lot. We're now spending over £100 billion a year just on debt interest. That's more than we spend on education, and it's one of the fastest growing lines in the government's budget. Why? Because a lot of our debt is linked to inflation. And when inflation surged after COVID and the energy crisis, our repayments surged with it. So yes, debt is real. Yes, it's expensive. But does it mean we're broke? Actually, no. Let's talk about where the money actually goes, because debt is just one piece of the puzzle. So every year, the UK government brings in about £1.2 trillion through taxes. That could be income tax, VAT, national insurance, corporation tax, fuel duty, you name it, you know the taxes. And here's roughly how that money gets spent, roughly. So please don't get feisty in the comments. So we've got about 300 billion that goes on health and social care. That's the NHS, local services, public health, and care homes. Around 120 billion on education, so schools, colleges, early years, and some university support. So roughly 110 billion on pensions and welfare, like universal credit, disability benefits, housing support, and around 110 billion on interest payments for the national debt that we just talked about. And then there's the rest, you got defense, policing, transport, justice, foreign aid, everything else. Now, On paper, that looks pretty sensible. You kind of have to admit. Fair. Or maybe not, but it looks sensible. But here is the issue. People don't experience budgets, they experience services. So when you're told we're spending more than ever on the NHS, but you still can't get a GP appointment or you're waiting 8 months to see a specialist, it doesn't feel like record investment. It feels like the system is broken. Same with education. Yes, more money is being spent in cash terms, but in real terms, after inflation, per pupil spending is still lower than it was in 2010. And local councils, they're a full-blown crisis. Croydon, I'm looking at you. So look, Birmingham Council is one of the largest in Europe, literally declared itself bankrupt. And Croydon, well, if you've been here a while, you know I have beef with Croydon Council personally, but Croydon did as well. So did Woking, and dozens more are warning they're next. So again, if we're spending so much, why does it feel like we're getting so little? Let's talk about austerity. Because the reason we're in this weird twilight zone where we're spending loads of money but nothing works is largely because of the decade-long public sector diet we went on after the 2008 financial crash. Between 2010 and 2020, successive governments cut deep and they cut wide. Local council funding fell by over 40% in real terms. Legal aid was gutted. Youth services, libraries, early years education, all chopped. The NHS was protected nominally, but underfunded relative to rising demand. Now, some people said this was responsible. Some people. They said, oh, we needed to live within our means, that we couldn't keep spending like a drunken sailor. But here is the thing. Wait. Austerity didn't fix public finances. The deficit shrank, yes, but the debt kept growing. Because the cuts stalled growth. And when growth stalls, tax revenues fall. And when tax revenues fall, you borrow more. That's just the cycle that we're in. So it becomes this vicious cycle. Overall, austerity didn't make us stronger. It made us weaker. And so now we're stuck. People want better services. The state is threadbare, but the government says we can't afford to invest because of the debt. That's the trap, and it's political. It isn't economic. So let's bust a myth. This one actually really winds me up. You'll hear it all the time. The government should manage its money like a household does. You can't spend more than you earn, or you wouldn't run your family like that, would you? And to say that, I say, well, no, because I don't issue my own currency. The UK government isn't a household. It's a sovereign currency issuer. It borrows in pounds, it taxes in pounds, it pays its civil servants in pounds. It can't run out of pounds. Now, can it create too much money and cause inflation? Yes. Can it borrow recklessly and undermine market confidence? Absolutely. But that's about how you borrow, not whether you can. Borrowing to build a hospital? Smart. Borrowing to fund a tax cut for landlords? Probably not smart. We actually need to stop pretending that government budgets are like our own. They're not. And that metaphor is holding us back from making smart decisions. Okay, let's zoom out for a moment. The UK has made a series of choices about what we fund, what we tax, and what we cut. But those aren't the only choices available. France has a higher debt ratio than us, but spends more on pensions, childcare, and housing. Now, I know they're going through their own little pension brouhaha at the moment, but they've made that choice. So people value those services. Germany is debating whether to scrap its debt brake to invest in clean energy. And the US, despite all its chaos, and let's face it, there's a lot, has pumped trillions into infrastructure, climate, and innovation. And here's a wild fact that may surprise some of you, but probably not others. The UK actually has one of the lightest tax burdens on wealth in the entire developed world. We don't tax property properly, so council tax, I know we all hate paying it, but it's still based on 1991 values. Capital gains at the same rate as income, we don't do that. And second homes and land to any meaningful degree. So we say we can't afford to fix the NHS, but we can afford to subsidise private school fees through charity loopholes. It's not about affordability, it's about priorities. And let's face it, there was certain people in the media class that when VAT was imposed on independent schools, they were screaming and shouting and talking about how people were just jealous of this 7%. And I just really felt like, how can you say that people are jealous just because you can't now afford something? Because when taxes rise on other people, there's a shrug and that's what you have to pay. But now that VAT is being imposed on the service that you are receiving from a business, you're screaming that people are jealous. Again, we just have really weird priorities in this country. So, are we broke? Personally, perhaps. As a nation, no. We have wealth, we are resourceful, and we are capable. But we're also risk averse, we lack vision, and politically, there's a lot of cowardice. There's almost been this thing where people have convinced themselves that being fiscally responsible basically means doing nothing rather than finding a way to do things well by doing things wisely or being more creative or really thinking about the problems at hand. Because the fact is, the UK isn't bankrupt, it's just stuck. So the next time someone tells you, oh, well, there's just no money left, ask them, no money left for who? I really wanted to do this episode today because I felt like there's a lot of discourse, and I've kind of fed into that in some cases, just as a way of explaining what on the surface appear to be the economic situation or is the economic situation. But I think there's a gap between our perception of the situation and the reality of it. And the reason I say that is because we have a lot of our economic situation, our current financial and economic situation, is actually driven by political motivations and ideology. This is something that doesn't come up a lot because we tend to think of economics as inevitable, as this kind of science that sits outside of the political environment in which we live and is just market forces. But invariably, market forces are driven by policy, they are driven by the government's position, they are driven by the stability in government and decisions that are taking. Case in point, Liz Truss comes in to do her, I don't know, secondment, 6 weeks summer holiday job or whatever it was she does, and manages to crash the economy. Now, did all of those things that she wanted to enact come to pass? No. On the mere fact that she was proposing them and trying to put those mechanisms in place, the market reacted to that and it was negative. So this idea that these economic forces exist as a self-functioning, autonomous machine that is purely scientific is something that we kind of need to step away from and really think about what is driving these things. The issue that I have noticed, and the issue that kind of comes to mind when I'm listening to like podcasts and, you know, experts, and this is not me trying to kind of think that I know better than all of these people that have studied these things for their whole lives. But one of the themes, one of the threads that you'll find if you listen to people speaking about these things is that whilst they will say, if X happens, Y will happen, there is a reluctance to talk about what if S happens, because the natural response to S isn't a natural one because the government doesn't have the courage to take S as a choice, if that makes any sense. So my thoughts here are that if you're going to make any decision, the markets need to have confidence in you. And what the markets don't like is change and all of these other things. However, because we haven't made the right decisions in this country for the last over a decade, because we've been in this case of austerity and cuts, what we are seeing is if you're in IT, the second system impact of this. We thought we were cutting services to save money, to reduce the deficit. That's what we thought we were doing, right? But you think about this, you cut money, and so now people can't get the appointments they need to get early intervention for healthcare issues. So they don't get the early intervention for healthcare issues. What happens next? is whatever the issue is, it gets worse or it gets compounded because they haven't seen a medical professional. So then they need more treatment, which is more expensive, which is more of a burden on the public purse than if they'd actually had that earlier appointment with their GP or with a specialist to be able to sort out the issue. We have a similar thing with youth services. There's all these cuts to youth services. Oh, we can cut this, it's fine. They can just go to school and go home. Don't worry about young people. They'll figure it out. Young people, brains developing, figuring it out. What invariably happens? Crime tends to rise. So then you need to spend more money on policing, or you don't. There are always knock-on impacts or knock-on effects to these decisions to cut things. I've worked in finance for a very long time. I've worked in insurance for a very long time. And in insurance, there's something called modelling. I'm not talking about Naomi Campbell or any of you IG baddies, although if you want to get into insurance, just do it. But I'm talking about the modelling and scenario modelling of risks that could happen, because insurance essentially is a risk transfer mechanism. And so what they need to do is try to kind of see what the risks are and quantify how much it will cost to cover those risks, right? So they do that a lot in, catastrophe modeling and stuff like that. They try to figure out what is the worst case scenario and how would we cover that. And because you do that, you have these iterations of the things, the outcomes that you can have. You have the stimulus and you have the outcomes that you can get. And so then you can plan accordingly. And sometimes they don't, sometimes they miss the mark. But the idea is that you have an awareness, because whilst an insured peril or whatever might be fortuitous for the person taking out the insurance, the policyholder, for you as an underwriter or an insurance company, you don't want to be caught off guard. Again, sometimes they are, but for the most part, you want to model that risk so that you are aware of what may come up and you'll be able to meet that head on. One of the things I find really interesting is that when we are making these cuts, when the government says, I'm going to make this decision to do this or do this or do this, there is no modeling of that. There is no, what are the impact of that? What are the secondary impacts of this? What could be the fallout for this? Because what we are doing is making a lot of cuts that are costing us so much money. These cuts are not saving us money. They are costing us so much money. For me, it's almost like, say you have a car, and you need this car to get to work, and the car is costing you, round number, £100 a month. You don't earn that much money, so £100 a month is quite a lot to you. But that car gets you to work on time, also gets you to get your groceries and stuff, various other things. You decide, if I walk to work, it's going to take me 2 hours, but I can walk it 2 hours each way. I can save £100 a month. So you decide to do that. It's fine. You're saving £100 a month. It's a lot of money. You start walking 2 hours every day, but now you're tired at work, so your output isn't very good. And there's an impact that you're getting performance reviewed and they're saying, you know what, we don't know if you're going to make it. You also don't get home in time to do stuff with your kid. So your kid is home alone and kind of getting into trouble for other things. That means that you're now getting calls at work because your kid is getting into trouble at school or getting calls from other places. You're also going through shoes a lot more, because walking 4 hours a day is ridiculous, right? So you're spending much more money on shoes than you ever did, because you're getting through those shoes like nobody's business. When you add it up over a period, because it doesn't seem apparent straight away, you've like, wow, I've got this extra £100. What happens is that getting rid of that car that was costing you £100 a month, and I know it's a dream to have a car that costs you £100 a month. I know it's not going to be that, but for illustrations purposes, where you thought you were saving money, it's ended up costing you money. And the thing is, why I think this may, is kind of a fitting analogy, is because also there's a mental toll that these things take on you. So the mental toll of doing this as well is much different than when you had a 20-minute drive in your car and you were able to do things. Now you're tired. You have to try and focus at work. You get home and you're tired. You now have to cook. You have to do all of those things compound to make this not a saving at all. And if you had thought about that and did the scenario testing and the modelling, not that you would necessarily in your personal life, but that thought should go into governmental decisions, because the impact is far wide reaching. This is just something for you and your family. when it comes to the government, this impacts whole swathes of people. Because even if you're not directly affected by cuts to benefits, for example, even if you're not directly affected by cuts to youth services, you're affected by crime, though. There are other things that will turn up on your doorstep, even if the cuts don't. So that's all I've got time for today. Thank you for joining me on this episode. If you've got any questions or anything, feel free to leave a comment and I'll try and get back to you as soon as possible. I'm also on other platforms. So if you are interested, I'm on TikTok and on Instagram at The Reluctant Accountant. That's at The Reluctant Accountant. And if you are listening to this as an audio, then you can also see me. I have a channel on YouTube, The Reluctant Accountant. You can go over there and watch the video for this and enjoy that. Enjoy looking at my face for no other reason than, there's nothing else to do. So that's where I'm going to leave it. I will be back next week with some equally exciting subject matters. But in the meantime, in between time, be well, be safe, and be as free as you can be.